Donc, nous allons donner cette présentation à deux voix.
There are going to be two of us making this presentation. Firstly, me, Guillaume Piton. I'm a researcher at the INRAE in Grenoble, and I prepared this with one of my colleagues, and Nathalie Nouveau will be presenting with me. She is the head of this division, the Métropole Nice-Côte d'Azur, and she'll be talking about damage, reconstruction to territories, whilst I'm going to speak more in a descriptive way about the effects of the Alex storm that took place in October 2020, and it had a very strong impact on our area. I'd like to thank ONF RTM in the Alpes-Maritimes, who really made a huge contribution to the work that we're presenting today. So the case study is focusing on the department of Les Alpes-Maritimes, and here's a map of the watersheds that was prepared by one of my colleagues. And today we're going to be talking about the three watersheds that we see here, La Tinée, that's the lower intermediate part of the catchment, the Vésubie and the Roya. We'll be focusing on these ones, but the Var that goes right down to the city of Nice also was subject to this significant flooding at the same time. But in our three upstream watersheds, the effect was even bigger. So what happened during the Alex storm? There was a huge amount of rainfall. Here's a map of the rain intensity. It was measured by radar and then corrected with data collected on the ground by different organizations. So Météo France, our weather agency, showed this. It shows the size of the event. You see some red zones. Here, there was over 500 millimeters that fell in 24 hours. Maybe we have some listeners from our overseas French territories, and they are subject to these types of rainfalls. And 500 millimeters in 24 hours, and even in the orange zones above 400 millimeters, is that considered really extreme? So we have four maps. You have the Alpes-Maritimes department that's drawn out, and the color code is associated to the return period. So here we have 1 hour, 6 hours, 24 hours, and the maximum return period that was observed in the for the analysis came from our colleagues at INRAE in Aix-en-Provence. They have a very detailed database of extreme rainfall, and we have quite large zones in the Vésubie and the Roya that are in black. And in these zones, we had municipalities, towns. And so the return period of the rainfall went beyond the millennial rainfall. So very intense rainfall. And the upper Vésubie and the Roya were the most severely hit. But in all of the areas, there was a huge amount of rainfall. I would have liked to give you some elements about the discharge, the flow rate in the river. It was obviously extremely high, and we'll see later the morphological changes made the estimations quite difficult. There's a work in process right now where they're trying to estimate the flow in the river. What were the results and the effects of this rainfall? So we'll talk about the hillsides. Here in the watershed of Ulion, there was a little stream that you can hardly see before the event, and there was a huge landslide that took place in the pastures. There were some ravines before the event. But I don't have a before picture, but trust me that there was vegetation everywhere. And you see how much land was destabilized. Hundreds thousands, maybe even a million cubic meters. We're still trying to quantify, but you see that there were significant amounts of sediment that came down into the little valley, and we'll see some images later. It went down to the valley bottom. So here you see an example of the contribution of sediment that happened during this storm. This is near the Tinée tunnel that goes towards Italy. The entrance to the tunnel is here, and there were 3 bridges that led to it. These bridges have disappeared. A landslide in a lateral ravine that was fully covered with trees and brush was washed away the bridges, and the bed of the Roya river was under the tunnel. And here you see the beginning of the Roya activity zone. So there was a lot of sediment that was carried. So these are the 2 major landslides that were due to the Alex storm, but there were a multitude of smaller events in this watershed. So the 2 stars, the yellow and blue, locate the landslides that I talked about. And in the effects that we see, this is an aerial photo taken quite high before the event, where you can see the rivers, you can see the Var riverbed, and then after the event, you see the Vésubie it can be detected even from space. You can see these rivers now. And downstream, we can see the Tinée that starts to appear, and there's a real widening of the riverbed. What we can see is that Tinée had a huge flood, but the geomorphological activity was quite important downstream at the confluence on the Vésubie River. If we compare the before and after, it's what we qualified as a river metamorphosis or river change. It was almost impossible to see from an aerial photo, and you couldn't see it under the canopy, and now you can detect 30 kilometers of the river. There's been a complete change of the morphology of this river. On the Roya riverbed, there were some gorges in the lateral part of the bed, but in the Roya also, we saw the emergence of a braided river facies that so huge changes in the river corridors. For the Vésubie channel, the city of Nice had had photos of the area before, and the IGN had just taken a photo of the French Geographic Survey 2 days before the event, so we could really study the changes. My colleague digitalized photos for many dates from the French Geographic Survey, and you can see after the war in 1948, the Vésubie River doesn't really stand out. In 97, there was a 100-year return flood that already carried away part of the banks, and then we see contraction of the active band over time up until 2017, where it's forest covered again, and now 2020 after the event. The analysis is quite impressive when you look at the width of the valley bottom. And the blue contour, it's what we qualified as the river bottom before the flood in 2018, and in orange and red, what you see is the valley bottom after the flood. There are islands here. Left bank, right bank are opposite on the chart, but what you can see is that the outlet point on the right side was increased by 10 meters of height and almost 40 meters of height widening on the other bank. So it took away the trees and all of the plants. It widened the active band, but it actually widened the valley. There were whole sides of the hills that were encompassed, and it created this wider valley. Now, if we look at the surface of the active band in the channel, we have some markers in roughly 1950. It represented 70 hectares for the catchment area. Nothing really changed until 1997. There was a 100-year return flood. The Vésubie went up to 100 hectares. And then the same transits everywhere. The vegetation started to come back and was taking over the gravel beds. And little by little, the river contracted until the next event. And then you see the Alex storm. And this is the width of the valley bottom. And you can see here that the total surface area of the Vésubie, Roya, and Madone riverbed occupies practically the entire river valley bottom after this flood. So we have a river that was limited in a mature vegetated riverbeds that now occupies 76% of the valley bottom. And it's expanded into the hillsides on a certain number of points. And we wondered, there were a lot of log jams. And so we wanted to understand how much wood was actually carried away. So we digitalized. Here's an aerial photo of the river just after the event, and you see the active band. And these were tree trunks that were digitalized manually. And we've counted more than 40,000 between the Vésubie and the Roya that were carried away. So we intersected this with the wooded areas before, the green zones on the map. And in yellow and red, you can see what is now the active band of the river. All the trees were pulled out and carried away. This is a longitudinal study on the Roya. And for the 40 kilometers of length of the Roya, you can see the number of trees per reach. The negative numbers are the ones that were deposited. There was a lot more pulled away than were deposited. The second is the same, but in volume, cubic meters of wood that was ripped away. And here we have forest density. And we estimate that between the pink and the green, we have a volume that was exported along the Roya, 10,000 to 25,000 cubic meters of wood that went through Italy and then out to the sea. There's a huge amount of dead wood on the Saint-Laurent-du-Var beach. Now I'm going to hand the floor to Nathalie Nouveau, who's going to talk about the damage and the other more managerial aspects. Hello, everyone. My name is Nathalie Nouveau. I'm in charge of water and rainfall in department. And I work on flood prevention. It's a new mandatory competence for the intermunicipal organizations in France since 2018. But of course, the municipalities didn't wait for this law to come into effect to start working on these questions. And we've been working on river management and flooding for many, many years now. The metropole includes 40 municipalities, represents 500,000 inhabitants. And each year we have 10 million tourists that come to our area. The seaside is very well known, but there are also the valleys, the Vésubie. So we have very diffuse habitat because there are small villages in these little valleys. It's quite an area. It's an area that's got a lot of tourism, and there are a lot of activities linked to nature. This exceptional event, the Alex storm, really transformed the landscape. There's some illustrations here on the screen of the effect of the change in the morphology of the river. There was a liquid and solid flow.
Nathalie, est-ce que tu peux parler bien en face de ton micro, s'il te plaît, pour qu'on t'entende bien, parce qu'on a un peu un problème de son.
So we're having some difficulty understanding, Nathalie. So the transformation that's illustrated here, we see the damage in the Vésubie and the Roya. So the first report concerned damage to people. Nine people died, and there are 9 missing people. In terms of habitat, these homes are on the riverside. About 100 buildings were either destroyed or damaged or are untouched, but they're at risk now because of the way the banks have been transformed. If we try to evaluate or describe the impact of the Alex storm, that so in my department, we're in charge of sanitation and the roads, systems, transport, water. And in the Nice-Côte d'Azur metropolis, there were 14 municipalities that were heavily impacted in these valleys, including Saint-Martin, Vésubie, Roque-Billière, the roads took a heavy hit because the roads really were beside the rivers in these narrow valleys. So 50 kilometers were devastated. 130 kilometers were closed temporarily because there are only single roads that feed a lot of these little villages. And there were 19 bridges that were washed out and many others that were damaged due to the log jams, the sediment transport, and just the flow of the river. For water supply, the 2 valleys were very impacted. 60% of the people in the valleys, so more than 13,000 households, were without drinking water. All of the tapping points were damaged, and it was impossible to take water. And we're still having problems with water supply today because of a high turbidity in the river and a lot of sediment. There was an impact on our sanitation system. Also, 6 water treatment plants were devastated. At the scale of the metropolis, there are financial needs for reconstruction. It's assessed at 1 billion euros. And for the whole department, we're looking at 3 billion euros. We're still in a phase where we're doing emergency work, so the final budget has not really been understood. We've been repairing access roads, and as soon as it's possible, we finalize the work, but we've had to come up with a lot of temporary measures to make it possible for people to access their villages. In the emergency phase, in the reconstruction needs, immediately after and in the first few months after the storm, we wanted to reestablish access points. In the first few days and weeks, there was no access at all. Helicopters transported in food and water and rescue services. We tried to reestablish the roads so that we could then repair the infrastructure. So the working conditions, of course, are very complicated, very difficult. And the 2 valleys remain very sensitive to hydroclimatic conditions. In December, there was a small rain event that generated another landslide that meant that we had to close the main road and to build a temporary road in the riverbed. So there's an impressive amount of work that still has to be done. We feel that it's going to take 4 to 5 years to rebuild completely. We have to build the final roads, bridges that will take several years, drinking water and sanitation networks. We've got temporary water treatment plants, but we have to rebuild permanent ones. And in the management of the aquatic environment and flood prevention, we had some infrastructure that was also ripped away, so we're having to rebuild that. And we need really to stabilize the banks in the dangerous areas that are still potentially exposed to erosion today. Difficulty rebuilding also. There were a few hundred buildings that were damaged or destroyed. In some areas, we can rebuild. But as Guillaume said, the rivers have taken a big part of the valley bottom now. And so it's going to be impossible to rebuild in these highly exposed areas. So the reconstruction is going to be a big challenge from that point of view. And we're going to have to relocate some activities. Resilience. We're in a territory that's suffered many problems in the last few years in the Alpes-Maritimes.
Parle bien dans ton micro toujours, Nathalie, s'il te plaît. Voilà, excuse-moi parce qu'on ne t'entend pas forcément bien en articulant bien. Merci. Je t'en prie.
So they've asked Nathalie to get closer to her microphone. So on October 3rd every year, they have a day about risks. And on October 3rd, 2015, there were floods. We had a terrorist attacks in 20. We had also in 2019 had 8 weeks of storms, and in some watersheds, 800 millimeters of rainfall. So there was already some reconstruction work underway, and dam and bank protection work underway. And in addition to Alex, we had the COVID crisis. So we've had to work in very difficult conditions this winter with the lockdown. But of course, reconstruction was a priority. And in these areas that really live from sports and winter sports activity like skiing, it's added an additional social and economic impact to this terrible storm that took place. So for challenges to take up, the first one is the reconstruction of infrastructure. In situations that are still quite risky. And we're trying to re-employ the materials that the river has made available to us. Because of the condition of the roads, we can't bring in heavy trucks with rock fill. Our roads are still very fragile. So on an organizational level, people have been extremely active, the departments of the state and all levels of local government and cells that were created to help out with volunteers also. So all of these cells are dealing with different topics, some on the riverbed management, and they're continuing their work. So the local authorities are highly involved. This is our main activity and has been since the storm. Companies are also very involved in the Alpes-Maritimes area since the storm. At the administrative level, we're still applying emergency procedures. Even if the event took place 8 months ago, we're still managing under emergency procedures, which makes it possible for us to use the law that had plans for quick reconstruction in these emergency circumstances. We're working with services of the state on the 2 most damaged villages.
Afin que les différentes maîtrises d'ouvrage, puisqu'on n'est pas les seuls à intervenir, aménagent de manière cohérente.
So that we can do the best job possible in protecting the river banks and the river beds. So in France, the French government has planned for special funds in these circumstances, the state solidarity grants that are for some existing public equipment. We've seen with some of the images that they're working on bank reconstruction to make sure that they won't be eroded as of the next heavy rainfall event. So we have to find the finances also to do this. There's also a land question. So a lot of the property is private property. And under French law, the river belongs to private owners. There are some exceptions like the Vésubie, the lower valley of the river. So it's a challenge to work with a lot of different partners in these areas, the different property owners. So we're trying to see how that can happen. Another important challenge, and Guillaume touched on this in his presentation, that's the management of knowledge. Since the Alex storm, we have been studying all of the data that's been produced. There's a lot of scientific work taking place and technical work, and we want to be able to gather all of this knowledge to make sure that we're doing our best in flood prevention in the future and to rebuild properly with the uncertainties, with the potential dynamics of the river. We also have to manage the different time scales. So we're still working on an emergency basis today. In the short term, we're trying to create structures that will be sustainable in certain conditions. And we're expecting to manage the next events in the next rain season and flood season. As Guillaume said, there's a stock of sediment in the valleys that will probably be remobilized when the discharge in the river increases. And it's going to have an impact on the riverbanks again. So there will be potential changes to the river morphology.
Thank you, very exhaustive. It introduces the continuation, the question that we are being asked about. I didn't mention that, but we know my colleagues and the ONF is driving the return of experience, the REX on the geomorphology. And we do work on what happened during the storm, of course, the event, but we want to know what happened afterwards first, before talking about the medium term. Let's look at the long term. Well, this diagram, which I like very much, which dates back from 2010, which states that at longer time scales, 1,000 years, well, it could be 10,000, whatever, rivers are dynamic. They change their profile. There would be sudden progressive changes, transient, between rivers that may become wider, narrower, change their morphology, whatever. What should be borne in mind in the Alps, this is a map of the extension of glaciations during the last glaciation period. These little caterpillars are glaciers, and the Vésubie, Roya, and Tinée valleys were filled with glaciers. The little dots downstreams are the extension of the previous glaciation period. So that's back to 12,000, 20,000 years ago, were covered with ice and were reshaped by glaciers. Now, if we narrow down the time scale, our colleagues from the ONF-RTM did digitalize the land survey of 1873, and this is the little blue note, the little blue trace you see. And at the end of the 19th century, whereas in many other catchment basins, especially in Northern Alps, the rivers were very wide, following with the short ice age, which started the Middle Age. You know, the rivers were narrow, but in 2009, the Beauvallon, you see this photo, we can barely see the little river. And in 2020, you see all of a sudden the size. So what should be borne in mind is the fact that at the scale of 10,000 years, the rivers did evolve. At the end of the short ice age, well, this was not very wide, but the Alex storm came and changed completely, drastically, in 24 hours, changed completely the river. And now if we look at the time, long-term system, the system's been fully modified. Now the question is, what will happen in the medium term within a few years, a few decades? Will the system find a new balance point that will remain very wide because the sediments have been destabilized in such depths, landslides have been so strong, significant that sediments will feed the profile of Vésubie, a river, or as often as we showed at the beginning of the presentation, will there be some kind of a progressive narrowing, a return to a river that is fairly narrow, which is not braided? So it's difficult to say. We got some paroxysmic or extreme events took place in 1940, for example, in the Pyrenees and in the Guillaume, which is a river, in 1957, which give us indications. Well, one additional factor that should be noted is climate change. And there, if we compare this to the major trends identified by the green arrow, we see that there are oscillations, the white strip, and now is hydrology aggravated, will widen the system and maintain very strong dynamics, or will it narrow it? We don't know. So by way of conclusion, what we showed in this presentation is that the Alex storm impacted the Alpes-Maritimes with exceptional long-lasting rain events. Some landslides took place, which has somewhat increased the process downstream. The Vésubie and the Roya to another level experienced fluvial metamorphosis, and they changed from narrow stoned river to alluvial braided river, and the evolution thereof will remain to be defined. And locally, we talk about when meteorological bombs, damages are huge, and such a high number of 100 kilometers of roads, thousands of houses, hundreds of houses, and other problems. This raises other issues and challenges for the short-term management and long-term management to make sure that the valley will be resilient and will not be cut off from the world once there will be another rain event, significant rain event. Thank you for your attention. We were a bit longer than planned. Sorry about that.